Welcome, true crime aficionados, to a story that will curdle your blood and haunt your nightmares. We're about to descend into a darkness so profound, it's hard to believe it's real. Today, we unravel the chilling tale of the Ranch of Horrors, a place where the American dream twisted into a gruesome nightmare, and one man's evil knew no bounds. Before we step onto that blood-soaked ground, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the harrowing stories we unearth here. Now, brace yourselves as we delve into the heart of depravity, a story of how one man fed fish with human bones. The heat in Elmendorf, Texas, had a personality of its own. It was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket woven from dust and shimmering air that settled over the flat, unforgiving landscape. In the mid-1930s, as the Great Depression gnawed at the soul of America, this heat felt like another form of poverty, another hardship to be endured. The dust got into everything. The folds of your clothes, the back of your throat, the cracks in your spirit. For the desperate souls drifting through this part of the country, any shelter from the sun and the silence was a godsend. And in the parched heart of Behar County, Joe Ball's Sociable Inn was just such a place. From the road, it wasn't much to look at. A low-slung, timber frame building with a wide, covered porch that offered a sliver of shade. A hand-painted sign, its letters peeling under the relentless sun, read The Sociable in cold beer, good times. It was a typical roadside tavern, a dime-a-dozen establishment catering to weary farmhands, itinerant workers, and locals looking to wash away the grit of their lives with a cheap nickel beer. But the Sociable Inn had something no other tavern for 100 miles could boast of. A bizarre and magnetic attraction that drew curious crowds from San Antonio and beyond. Joe Ball's Alligators. Behind the saloon, dug deep into the baked Texas earth, was a large concrete-lined pit filled with murky, stagnant water. A high, sturdy chain-link fence surrounded it, a necessary precaution, for within the pit lived 5 large alligators. They were Joe's pets, his pride and joy, his main event. On weekends, he'd put on a show, charging a small fee for folks to watch him toss live chickens, raccoons, or stray dogs into the pit. The spectacle was gruesome, primal, and utterly captivating. The crowd would gasp and cheer as the powerful reptiles, usually languid and still as logs, would erupt into a frenzy of thrashing tails and snapping jaws. It was a raw, bloody slice of the wild, served up right next to the civilized clinking of beer bottles. The man at the center of this strange circus was Joseph D. Ball himself. To most, he was an enigma, a man of stark contradictions. He was a war hero, having served with distinction in the trenches of Europe during the Great War. The experience had left its mark on him, etching a permanent hardness into his pale blue eyes and leaving him with a pronounced limp. He rarely spoke of the war, but it hung about him like a shroud, lending him an air of quiet authority and a capacity for violence that most men only read about in pulp novels. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way, with a strong jaw and a quick, disarming smile that he could switch on and off like a lamp. He was a shrewd businessman, a charismatic host when he wanted to be, and the undisputed king of his small, dusty empire. But there was another side to Joe Ball, a darker current that ran deep beneath the charming surface. He had a temper that could flare up with the sudden, violent intensity of a heat lightning strike. His moods were unpredictable, swinging from affable generosity to sullen, brooding silence. He was a notorious womanizer, and the waitresses at the Sociable Inn were a constantly revolving cast of young, pretty, and often vulnerable women. They were drawn to him by his confidence, his promises of a steady job in unsteady times, and the illusion of protection he offered. They served the beer, laughed at the customers' jokes, and endured Joe's possessive, controlling gaze. For many of these girls, Elmendorf was just a stop on a long road to somewhere better. For some, it would be the end of the road altogether. One such girl was Minnie Gotthard. She arrived in Elmendorf in the spring of 1937, stepping off a dusty bus with a single, worn suitcase and a hopeful look in her eyes that hadn't yet been scoured away by the Texas sun. She was 22, with a cascade of dark hair and a resilient spirit. She was fleeing a dead-end life in a forgotten corner of the state, and Joe Ball's help-wanted sign seemed like a sign from Providence itself. Joe hired her on the spot, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. Minnie, grateful for the work, ignored the faint prickle of unease. The first few weeks were a blur of long hours and hard work. Minnie was good at her job. She was quick with a smile, remembered the regulars' orders, and knew how to handle the rough-around-the-edges clientele. She learned to navigate Joe's moods, to be cheerful when he was jovial, and to make herself scarce when his eyes grew cold and distant. She even grew accustomed to the alligators, the guttural hisses, and the sudden, violent splashes from the pit behind the bar. They were just part of the strange tapestry of her new life. She moved into a small room that Joe rented out to his staff, and soon, she fell into the inevitable, unspoken role of his girlfriend. It was less a romance and more a transaction, an extension of her employment. Joe was possessive and jealous, but he could also be charming, buying her pretty dresses and telling her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Minnie, who had known little kindness in her life, allowed herself to believe him. She tried to ignore the way he watched her, his gaze a constant, heavy weight. She dismissed the stories the other girls whispered about his cruelty, about the waitresses who had left in the middle of the night, sometimes without even collecting their pay. They were just jealous, she told herself. But the illusion began to crack. She saw the flash of real, terrifying anger in his eyes when a customer paid her a compliment. She felt the bruising grip of his hand on her arm when he pulled her away from a conversation he didn't like. He started to control every aspect of her life. Who she spoke to, where she went, how she spent her meager earnings. The sociable inn, once a symbol of her independence, was becoming a prison, and Joe Ball was the warden. One sweltering July evening, after a particularly busy Saturday night, Minnie and Joe had a fight. The details were lost to the sticky night air, swallowed by the chirping of the crickets and the low hum of the beer coolers. But the sound of it was not. A local farmer, heading home late, heard angry shouts coming from the inn long after it had closed. He heard a woman's voice, pleading, then a sharp, desperate cry, followed by a sudden, chilling silence. He hesitated, his hand on the door of his truck, but the silence that followed was so absolute, so profound, that he convinced himself he had imagined it. People fought. It was none of his business. He drove on, the memory of that cry already fading, replaced by thoughts of his failing crops and mounting debts. Minnie Gotthard was never seen again. The next morning, Joe Ball opened the saloon at his usual time. He was in a remarkably good mood, whistling a cheerful tune as he wiped down the bar. A new girl was behind the counter, a pretty blonde named Dolores. When a regular asked where Minnie was, Joe just smiled his easy smile and said she'd run off. "Took my money and lit out with a traveling salesman," he said, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. "You can't trust any of 'em. That's what I've learned." And just like that, Minnie was gone. In a place and time where people frequently disappeared, swallowed by the vastness of the country in their search for work, it wasn't particularly alarming. A girl running off was a common enough story. The sheriff, a portly, complacent man named Luke O'Brien, was a friend of Joe's. He accepted the story without question. He had a beer on the house, clapped Joe on the shoulder, and told him he was better off without her. But a few things didn't quite add up. Minnie hadn't taken her suitcase, which still sat in her room half-packed. Dolores, the new girl, was seen a few days later wearing a distinctive silver locket that Minnie had worn every single day, a gift from her late mother. When asked about it, Dolores nervously claimed it was a gift from Joe. The whispers started, quiet at first, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. They were passed between the other waitresses in hushed tones, exchanged as knowing glances between the townsfolk. Something was wrong at the sociable inn. A month later, another waitress, a fiery redhead named Hazel Brown, got into a public argument with Joe on the porch of the inn. She called him a liar and a cheat and threatened to go to the sheriff in San Antonio about his illegal gambling operation. The next day, Hazel was gone. Joe's story was the same. She'd stolen from the till and skipped town. It was plausible. Hazel had a reputation for being wild. But like Minnie, she had left all her belongings behind. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The high turnover of waitresses at the sociable inn was no longer just a local curiosity. It was becoming a local legend, a dark joke with a terrifying punchline. The men still came for the cheap beer, but they watched Joe Ball with a new kind of look in their eyes, a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The women of Elmendorf warned their daughters to stay away from him, to never, ever take a job at his saloon. Deputy Sheriff John Miller was new to Behar County. He was a young, ambitious lawman from a bigger city up north, transferred to this rural outpost to, as his former captain put it, learn some patience. Miller was not a patient man. He was methodical, observant, and he didn't believe in coincidences. He'd heard the whispers about Joe Ball, and unlike Sheriff O'Brien, he wasn't inclined to dismiss them. He started a small, unofficial file. He wrote down the names: Minnie Gotthard, Hazel Brown. He noted the dates they were last seen, the identical stories Joe told about their departures. He noted that both women had been Joe's lovers. He noted that both had vanished after a fight with him. One evening, Miller drove out to the sociable inn, parking his dusty patrol car a good distance down the road. He walked through the scrub brush, the thorny branches scratching at his trousers, until he had a clear view of the back of the property. The saloon was closed for the night, the windows dark. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging over the alligator pit, casting long, eerie shadows. And then he saw him. Joe Ball emerged from the back door of the saloon, his limp more pronounced in the dim light. He was carrying a large, heavy metal bucket. He moved with a grim purpose, his face a mask of concentration. He unlatched the gate to the enclosure, his movements practiced and sure. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He watched as Joe approached the edge of the pit. The alligators, sensing his presence, began to stir, their dark shapes gliding silently through the black water. Joe lifted the bucket. For a moment, he stood there, a dark silhouette against the pale Texas sky. Then, with a grunt of effort, he tipped the bucket forward, emptying its contents into the pit. Miller couldn't see exactly what was in the bucket, only that it was dark, heavy, and seemed to contain chunks. The water erupted. The alligators, in a sudden, terrifying frenzy, thrashed and snapped, their powerful jaws closing on the offerings. The sound a series of wet, percussive crunches carried across the still night air, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Miller's neck stand on end. Joe Ball stood and watched for a long time, his posture utterly still. He seemed to be savoring the moment, the master of his grotesque domain. When the frenzy in the water subsided, he turned and walked back to the saloon, the empty bucket swinging at his side. He didn't look back. Deputy Miller remained hidden in the brush, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had no proof of anything. He had seen a man feed his pets. But what he felt, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, was that he had just witnessed the disposal of the dead. He had seen a man feeding his secrets to the monsters in his backyard. The whispers were true. The dark joke was no joke at all. The sociable inn wasn't just a tavern. It was a ranch of horrors, and Joe Ball wasn't just a saloon keeper. He was a hunter, and his waitresses were his prey. The night closed in around Miller, thick and suffocating, filled with the phantom echoes of a woman's desperate cry. He knew then that this was only the beginning. More girls would disappear. More secrets would be fed to the depths. He had to stop it. But how do you catch a devil who feeds his sins to alligators? The image of Joe Ball standing by the alligator pit, a dark silhouette against the dying light, became seared into Deputy Miller's mind. It was the anchor point for his growing obsession, the scene that played over and over in the quiet hours of the night. The sound of the frenzied splashing and the sickening crunch of jaws on boner, what he imagined was bone, was a constant, grim soundtrack to his days. He knew, with an instinct that transcended evidence, that Joe Ball was a murderer. But knowing and proving were two different countries, separated by a vast, unbridgeable chasm of law and influence. Sheriff O'Brien was a roadblock at every turn. He was a man who preferred the path of least resistance, and in Behar County, that path always led away from confronting a man like Joe Ball. Ball was a war hero, a local businessman, and a generous contributor to the sheriff's re-election campaign. He brought in tourist dollars with his bizarre alligator show. To O'Brien, he was a pillar of the community, albeit a slightly eccentric one. The missing waitresses were, in his view, a footnote to the Depression. Girls like that, Miller, they're like tumbleweeds, he'd said, leaning back in his creaky office chair, his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. They roll in, they roll out. No roots, no reason to stay. Joe's just unlucky in his hiring is all. Miller knew he was on his own. He began to work in the shadows, using his off hours to build a case that no one had asked him to build. He drove hundreds of miles, chasing down rumors and tracking down the waitresses who had managed to escape the sociable inn's orbit. Most of them were too afraid to talk. The mere mention of Joe Ball's name was enough to drain the color from their faces and send them scurrying back into the anonymity of their new lives. They spoke of his temper, his cold rages that would descend without warning. They described a man who demanded absolute loyalty and punished the slightest perceived transgression with terrifying verbal abuse and, sometimes, physical violence. One woman, a former waitress named Clara, finally agreed to speak with him, but only in a crowded San Antonio diner, far from Elmendorf. She was a pale, nervous woman whose hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. "He told me once," she whispered, her eyes darting towards the door, "that he had a way of making problems disappear. He was cleaning his rifle, and he just looked up at me and smiled, said the alligators weren't picky eaters, that they could digest anything, even belt buckles." She started to cry, silent tears tracing paths through her cheap face powder. "I packed my bag that night. I didn't even wait for my pay. I just ran. I knew if I stayed, I'd end up as gator food." Her story was horrifying, but it was still just that, a story. Hearsay. It wasn't the kind of evidence a prosecutor could take to a jury. Miller needed something tangible, something that couldn't be dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled ex-employee. He needed a body. But how could he find a body when the killer had his own private, living, breathing disposal system? Meanwhile, life at the sociable inn continued with a veneer of unnerving normalcy. Joe hired a new girl to replace Hazel Brown. Her name was Eva, a quiet, doe-eyed girl from a family of dirt-poor sharecroppers. She was followed by another and another. The faces changed, but the type was always the same. Young, pretty, and alone in the world. They were invisible victims, their disappearances leaving barely a ripple in the surface of society. Joe Ball himself seemed to be growing bolder, more arrogant. His control over the local machinery of justice, embodied by Sheriff O'Brien, made him feel untouchable. He reveled in the fear he inspired. He would watch Deputy Miller from the porch of his saloon whenever the patrol car passed, a smug, challenging smirk on his face. It was a silent, deadly game of cat and mouse, and Joe was convinced he would always be the cat. Miller's investigation began to take a toll on him. He became withdrawn, isolated. His nights were sleepless, his days filled with a gnawing frustration. He started drinking more than he should, the cheap whiskey doing little to dull the edges of his grim fixation. The people of Elmendorf watched him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He was the outsider, the troublemaker, the man who was trying to stir up a darkness they had all tacitly agreed to ignore. It was easier to believe Joe Ball's stories of runaway girls than to confront the monstrous possibility that a killer was living in their midst, serving them beer while their daughters remained settled at the bottom of a murky pit. The break Miller was so desperate for came from an unlikely source. A local handyman and known drunk named Clifton Wheeler had been a longtime associate of Joe Ball's. Wheeler was a man who lived on the fringes, performing odd jobs for cash or a bottle, his loyalty for sale to the highest bidder. He often did work around the sociable in fixing the plumbing, patching the roof, and, most importantly, helping Joe maintain the alligator pit. Wheeler was arrested one night for public intoxication after getting into a brawl at another town's bar. Hungover and desperate in a jail cell far from O'Brien's protective influence, Wheeler started to talk. At first, it was just drunken boasting, trying to impress his cellmates with his connection to the notorious Joe Ball. But a sharp-eared deputy overheard him mention Minnie Gotthart's name. The deputy called Miller. Miller drove through the night, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. He sat across from a bleary-eyed, trembling Clifton Wheeler in a small, stuffy interrogation room. He pushed a cup of black coffee across the table and waited. Wheeler, stripped of his alcohol-fueled bravado, was a pathetic figure. He was terrified of Joe Ball, but the prospect of a long jail sentence or worse, being implicated in a murder, terrified him more. "He came and got me that night," Wheeler mumbled, his voice hoarse. "The night Minnie disappeared. He was calm. Too calm. That's when Joe was most dangerous." Wheeler recounted how Joe had woken him up in the middle of the night, telling him he needed help with a mess. He led him to one of the small shacks on the property. Inside, Miller listened, his pen scratching furiously across his notepad, as Wheeler described a scene from a slaughterhouse. Minnie Gotthart's body was there, wrapped in a canvas tarp. Joe had a butcher's knife in his hand. He didn't explain what had happened. He didn't need to. He simply told Wheeler to help him. He made me help him cut her up," Wheeler sobbed, his face collapsing into his hands. "He said it was the only way, that the Gators couldn't manage a whole body." The confession was a torrent of gruesome detail. Wheeler described how they had dismembered the body, how Joe had worked with a chilling, methodical efficiency, like a butcher dressing a deer. He described the weight of the buckets, the stench of blood and offal, and the terrible, final sounds from the alligator pit. He confessed that this wasn't the first time. He had helped Joe dispose of Hazel Brown's body in the same manner. He claimed he never participated in the killing itself, only the cleanup. He was just a helper, a terrified accomplice trapped by his fear of a monster. "He paid me $100, Wheeler said, his voice barely a whisper. "And he told me if I ever said a word, he'd put me in that pit myself, piece by piece." Miller finally had it. It was a confession from an accomplice, a direct witness to the disposal of the bodies. It was the key he needed to unlock the entire horrific case. He now had the legal grounds to get a real warrant, to bypass Sheriff O'Brien and bring in the full force of the law. He drove back to Behar County as the sun rose, the grim Texas landscape looking, for the first time in a long time, like a place where justice might actually be possible. He went straight to a county judge, bypassing O'Brien's office entirely. He laid out his unofficial investigation, the testimony from the former waitress Clara, and the sworn, detailed confession of Clifton Wheeler. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense man, read the documents in silence, his expression growing darker with every page. He didn't hesitate. He signed the warrant for the immediate arrest of Joseph D. Ball on 2 counts of murder, and a second warrant for a full, comprehensive search of the entire property of the Sociable Inn. The time for secrets and shadows was over. That afternoon, 2 cars filled with deputies, with Miller in the lead, kicked up a cloud of dust as they sped down the road towards the Sociable Inn. Sheriff O'Brien was with them, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. He had been forced to come along, his authority usurped. The game was over and he had been played for a fool. As they pulled up to the tavern, they saw him. Joe Ball was sitting on the front porch in his usual rocking chair, a bottle of beer resting on the railing beside him. He wasn't surprised. He seemed to have been waiting for them. As the deputies fanned out, their shotguns held at the ready, Joe watched them with an unnerving calm. A strange, knowing smile played on his lips. It wasn't the smile of a man who was cornered. It was the smile of a man who held one last, terrible card to play. Deputy Miller stepped out of his car, the signed warrant clutched in his hand. He felt a surge of triumph, but it was tainted by a cold dread. He was walking towards the abyss, the heart of the darkness he had been chasing for months. "Joe Ball," Miller called out, his voice steady and clear. "I have a warrant for your arrest for the murder of Minnie Gotthard and Hazel Brown." Joe didn't answer. He just kept rocking, his pale blue eyes fixed on Miller. The smile never left his face. He slowly raised the beer bottle to his lips and took a long, slow drink, savoring it like it was his last. Then he set the bottle down with a soft click, stood up from his chair, and turned his back to the lawman, walking slowly and deliberately back into the dark interior of the sociable inn. The screen door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, tense silence. The slam of the screen door hung in the oppressive Texas air. For a moment, no one moved. The deputies stood frozen in a loose semicircle, their shotguns pointed at the dark, silent building. The sociable inn, which had always seemed so full of a sinister life, was now as quiet as a tomb. The only sounds were the buzz of flies and the faint, almost imperceptible rustle from the alligator pit out back. The lazy afternoon had transformed into a high-stakes standoff. "Joe, come out with your hands up," Sheriff O'Brien shouted, his voice betraying a tremor of fear. He was out of his depth, a small-town lawman confronting a darkness he had refused to believe existed. There was no response from inside. Deputy Miller's mind raced. Joe Ball was not a man to be taken alive. He was a creature of absolute control, a king in his own depraved kingdom. Surrender, trial, and imprisonment were not options he would ever entertain. Miller knew with a sickening certainty that this would not end peacefully. "He's not coming out," Miller said, his voice low and urgent. "He's not going to let us take him." He motioned for two deputies to cover the back door while he and O'Brien approached the front. Every instinct screamed at him to wait, to starve him out, but the warrant demanded action. He held his own revolver steady, his knuckles white. The porch boards creaked under their weight as they moved towards the door. Miller could smell the stale beer and cheap disinfectant that always clung to the place, a scent now mingled with the metallic tang of imminent violence. He pushed the screen door open. The interior of the saloon was dim, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the grimy windows. The bar was empty. Chairs were overturned. A cash register lay open on the counter, a few coins scattered beside it. It looked as if it had been ransacked in a hurry. And then they saw it. At the far end of the bar, a freshly opened cigar box sat on a table. Inside was a pile of cash and a handwritten note. Miller cautiously approached, his gun trained on the shadows in the back of the room. He picked up the note. The handwriting was a surprisingly neat scrawl. It was a list of names and numbers, bank accounts, people who owed him money. It was Joe Ball setting his affairs in order. It was a suicide note without the words of farewell. A floorboard creaked in the back room, Joe's private living quarters. "This is your last chance, Joe," O'Brien yelled, his voice cracking. The only reply was a click, a metallic, final sound that every man there recognized. It was the sound of a pistol's hammer being cocked. Before Miller could shout a warning or dive for cover, a single gunshot exploded from the back room. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a brutal cannon blast that shattered the tense silence. It was followed by the heavy, dull thud of a body hitting the floor. Silence returned, thicker and more profound than before. The deputies outside flinched. Miller and O'Brien stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, the smell of gunpowder now sharp and acrid in the air. Then, slowly, methodically, Miller moved forward, his pistol held in front of him, sweeping the room. He kicked open the door to the back quarters. Joseph D. Ball lay on the floor next to his bed. He had placed the barrel of a .45 caliber pistol against his heart and pulled the trigger. His pale blue eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, still holding a final, defiant glint of malice. He had chosen his own exit, delivering his only confession in a spray of blood and cordite. He had robbed them of a trial, of answers, of justice. He had taken his secrets with him, leaving behind only a legacy of horror. The aftermath was a grim, methodical affair. The sociable inn was no longer just a tavern. It was a sprawling crime scene. The Texas Rangers were called in, their crisp uniforms and professional demeanor a stark contrast to the dusty, complacent world of Sheriff O'Brien. They descended on the property like an army, and the full, stomach-turning scope of Joe Ball's depravity began to reveal itself. Clifton Wheeler, now a key state witness, walked the investigators through the property. With a trembling finger, he pointed out the places where Joe had buried things he didn't want found. They dug up a fire pit and found charred human bones and teeth. They found a toolbox containing personal effects of the missing women. A silver locket confirmed to belong to Minnie Gotthard, a class ring, scraps of clothing. The most horrific discoveries were yet to come. The alligator pit, the centerpiece of Joe's bizarre world, was drained. As the murky water receded, it revealed a sludge of mud, animal carcasses, and something far more sinister. Investigators in heavy boots waded through the foul-smelling muck, sifting through the grime. They found human remains. There were fragments of bony, a piece of a tibia, a section of a human skull, several vertebrae. Many of the bones bore scrape marks consistent with being gnawed on by alligators. The reptiles had done their job with gruesome efficiency, consuming most of the evidence, leaving behind just enough to confirm the unspeakable truth. It was impossible to identify all the victims from the scattered, ravaged remains. The pit did not give up its dead easily. Wheeler's confession, corroborated by the physical evidence, painted a chilling picture. He admitted to helping Joe Ball dispose of the bodies of Minnie Gotthard and Hazel Brown. But the investigation suggested the body count was much higher. Over the years, dozens of young women had passed through the doors of the sociable inn. The official estimate of Joe Ball's victims was placed at 5, but the Rangers privately believed the true number could be as high as 20. He had been killing for years, hiding in plain sight, his gruesome hobby protected by his reputation, his charisma, and a community's willful blindness. The story of the Alligator Man and his ranch of horrors became a national sensation. Newspapers ran lurid headlines, and reporters flocked to the small, forgotten town of Elmendorf, turning its shame into a spectacle. The sociable inn was torn down, its wood carted away as if it were infected with an evil that might otherwise spread. The alligators, the silent, living instruments of Ball's monstrous acts, were donated to the San Antonio Zoo, where they lived out their days, oblivious to their role in one of Texas's most gruesome chapters. Sheriff O'Brien quietly retired, his career and reputation shattered. Deputy John Miller was hailed as a hero, the tenacious lawman who refused to look away. But the victory felt hollow. He had stopped the killing, but he could not undo the horror. He would forever be haunted by the faces of the missing women from his files, their fates now confirmed in the most brutal way imaginable. The town of Elmendorf was left with a permanent scar. The place where the sociable inn once stood became a fallow, haunted piece of land that locals avoided. The story was passed down through generations, evolving from a horrific true crime into a grim local legend, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk behind a friendly smile and a cold bottle of beer. The abyss that Deputy Miller had peered into that night from the scrub brush had finally been exposed to the light. Yet its depths could never be fully measured. Joe Ball's final, violent act ensured that the full truth died with him. How many had he killed? Why had he done it? Was it for money? For jealousy? Or for the simple, terrifying thrill of exerting absolute power over another human being? The questions lingered, unanswered, echoing in the silence he left behind. The ranch was gone, but the horror it represented, the terrifying knowledge of what one man was capable of, would never truly be erased from the scorched Texas soil.